All right, so it's I believe it's 2 p.m. in your time in Nebraska. It's just afternoon here in my world in Seattle. So I think I'm just supposed to start, and so I'm going to start. I want to be respectful of people's time, and I hope everyone's doing well. One of the perks of doing this kind of work is every so often you get to travel our awesome country and go to new places. And it's too bad that we're all hunkered down during this pandemic and I don't get to visit Nebraska because I've never been to Nebraska, and it would have been an awesome opportunity to visit another part of the country. And so I hope everyone's doing well. And yeah, and this is something new for me as well. I'm a trial attorney by profession, and sometimes you do PowerPoints, and one of the things that people tell you when you do a PowerPoint is that you do not talk to the PowerPoint. You talk to your audience. And so I am literally talking to my PowerPoint right now and not talking to people. And so this is a new experience for me, and so bear with me. I'm going to try and get through it, and without any sort of human interaction or response. I don't know if I'm totally tanking or I'm doing a decent job. And so I beg for your forgiveness early on, and hopefully we'll all get through this. So I thought I'd start by telling folks a little bit about myself. As you can see from the title, and what I just said, I'm a prosecutor. I'm the Chief Deputy Prosecutor for the Juvenile Division of the King County Prosecutor's Office over here in Washington State. For those of you who aren't familiar with where King County is, it's the largest county in Washington, and it occupies the city that I'm sure all of you are familiar with, the city of Seattle. And so it's bizarre to me sometimes that I've become sort of an expert on this diversion program, because I've been a prosecutor for over 20 years now, and I would say the vast bulk of my career was doing very traditional prosecutor work, such as I spent most of my time prosecuting intimate partner violence and domestic violence cases, and spent a large portion of my career also prosecuting sexual assault cases and homicide cases and things like that. And then I ended up being assigned to our juvenile division as the head. And I think there was a lot of change in how I saw the effectiveness of our legal process. And it became very apparent that it didn't work for these kinds of cases. And so I do want to be very clear that what we're talking about here with the Family Intervention and Restorative Services program is very narrow in focus. We are only talking about dealing with that very unique challenge of young people who are violent in their homes, typically violent with their mothers and brothers and sisters. And this does not encompass what I think most people think of when they think domestic violence, which is intimate partner violence, and it certainly doesn't involve serious violence within the home. So for example, if a young person were to shoot a parent or stab siblings or things like that, which unfortunately in our world right now, that it can still happen. This isn't dealing with that. I think this program is really dealing with those kinds of cases. For those of you who work in the juvenile justice system probably see on a very regular basis, like we were seeing. And it's those kids who are struggling, growing up in a very challenging time in the world, lots of pressures, and families themselves going through a lot of stress and pressures, and parents sometimes not equipped with support to deal with these things. And then tensions rise and kids act out, because if you're at this conference, you're totally up to speed and familiar with the adolescent brain development and how young people's frontal lobes aren't really always working, and they could get triggered very easily, especially by their parents and siblings. And that's really what we're talking about here. And so I want to first start off by talking a little bit about the scope of this problem. When I took over as head of our juvenile division, I'd just been supervising our felony domestic violence unit in the adult, or in our adult criminal prosecution practice. And I remember when I took over, my predecessor told me, Jimmy, this will be a good fit for you because there's a lot of juvenile domestic violence, and your experience in the domestic violence area will serve you well taking over here. And I walked in there thinking to myself, oh, then what we're talking about is a lot of cases involving teen dating violence, where boyfriends or girlfriends being violent with their partners. And that's not to say that we don't have that issue in juvenile court, but what really shocked me was that the vast majority, we're talking like 90% of the domestic violence cases that we were seeing in juvenile court in King County were these types of cases where kids were being violent with their parents, breaking things, threatening their parents, assaulting their parents or their siblings. And what we found when we were looking at sort of the scope in King County was it occupied the largest category of violent juvenile offenses that we dealt with in King County. And it was 15% of all cases that we handled. And it accounted for the largest proportion of types of cases that ended up with kids being booked into our juvenile detention facility. In fact, if you were to take away shoplifting, juvenile domestic violence would be the number one category of cases that we dealt with in juvenile court. So this is not a program that deals with a small percentage of the cases that we're dealing with. And my guess is, while I'm talking to folks in Nebraska, I don't think this is a unique situation in King County. My guess is that every jurisdiction across our county struggles with this issue of how you deal with young people who are violent in their home. And it's not a small issue, and it's certainly something that we're all dealing with. So, one thing to think about is really trying to identify and understand what the parent-guardian experience is in these cases. Because I think if we don't take that victim-centered approach, it's hard for us to really know what's the best thing to do, right? And I think, before I get into this slide, I just want those of you who are on this call to really think to yourselves, if you yourselves may have children, or you're thinking of having children or whatever, or your children are grown up and they're out of the home already, but take yourself back to the time, or think about a time when you might have a teenager in your home who is your child, whether it's your biological child or a child that you have said, this is the person who I'm raising and this is part of my family. And I want you to think about what it would take for you to pick up that phone and call the police to get help because you are scared of your child. And so what we're talking about is, by the time that these parents call the police, they are in full-on crisis mode. This isn't, parents don't pick up the phone lightly to call the police on their children. And so what we find then when we talk to the victims in these cases is that nearly 90% of the incidents, the youth has already been violent in the home previously. And not surprisingly and totally predictable, the majority of parents report that they didn't call the police the first time that it happened, and they only called as they felt incapable or unable to deal with the crisis themselves. In King County, many parents report that the police actually come, but they don't do anything until they've called multiple times. And then by the time the kid ends up in the system with a case filed into juvenile court, the violent behavior has become so ingrained, and the pattern has become so ingrained that it becomes even more difficult to break that cycle of violence. And I want to touch a little bit on the issue of the police not doing anything. And I am swearing that this is certainly not a criticism of the police, because as we all know, they have an incredibly difficult job to do. And oftentimes, these are some of the most frustrating and difficult circumstances to deal with, because the parents themselves, who are the ones asking for help, don't know exactly what their options are, or have their own conflicting motives or issues that are going on with them. And so this is a very frustrating type of response for the police to respond to. And again, this is not a criticism of police, but what we do hear from parents is that oftentimes the police don't respond right away, because there is sort of this stigma or this belief or kind of this impression that this is something that the parents bring upon themselves, or they're at fault for what's going on. Somehow they're bad parents, and so they need to deal with this themselves. And as someone who works as a prosecutor in the system, I also accept that. I think some of the frustration from law enforcement is that the system doesn't do a good job of connecting these young people or these families with services. So they get called out to those homes over and over and over again. And so at some point, when you arrest a kid and remove him from the home just to be called back to that house in the next week, you do lose faith in whether or not the system is working. And so I sympathize with law enforcement in this dynamic. And that's part of why we were motivated in King County to do something different. Before I go any further, I do want to tell folks that I have another computer that if you type questions, I'll try and answer them. I'm gonna try my best to have my attention on both screens, so that if you do post a question, I can stop and answer them. I also want to warn you, like many of you, you're probably like educating your children at the same time. I have a 10-year-old who's doing remote learning in her room, and then I have 2 dogs here. And so if all things go to hell, I might have to take a break, but but please forgive me. So this is a quote from one of the parents who came through our program. And what struck me about this quote is that for those of you who have prosecuted intimate partner violence or dealt with intimate partner violence in the system, the interesting thing is the dynamics are very similar. There's that issue of fear and control that's going on in the household, and parents are fearful of their children, and the children have taken control over the household. And when you're in that situation, you become desperate and you don't know where to turn. And then the abuser oftentimes becomes more emboldened to continue doing what they're doing. And so this is before we developed our FIRS program. This was your typical response to youth domestic violence. And my guess is that this is not unlike what goes on in Nebraska or Oklahoma or Texas or California or New York or Florida or wherever you are. I think this is our very typical response for when crime occurs, right? And that's how we dealt with this issue. We said, well, a kid committed a crime in their home, and so we're going to respond with a criminal response. So parents call 911, the police respond, and in King County, we have 3 potential, paths that a case can go on. The youth is arrested and they're put in our juvenile detention facility, and the prosecutor, I review the case, and if it's legally sufficient, I file charges. And then the kid goes in front of a judge, and a kid gets a public defender, and we go through that process with me trying to prove that crime that I charged beyond a reasonable doubt. And then if and when I do that, then there are consequences, right? Or you might have the law enforcement officer responds, and maybe they're able to de-escalate and then make the police officer exercises his or her discretion to not arrest the kid. And then the family just goes on trying to fend for themselves. And then there's no court involvement or no offer of services. Or, this is something that I don't think is unique in King County. I think everyone does diversions, but a case might come to my office and I review it and it's eligible for some diversion process. And then we go down the road of maybe connecting the family with interventions. But I do want to point out at least what happens in King County, and again, probably everywhere else, is the two options where I'm involved or a prosecutor is involved in this. It can take months, if not sometimes, at least in my jurisdiction, it can take upwards of a year to get a case litigated, prosecuted, and a sentence imposed. Our system is incredibly slow. It's incredibly kind of prehistoric, if you will. And then even if we don't prosecute a case, what we've found is just that kind of administrative process of reviewing a case, then making some determination, and then routing it to another bureaucracy for them to get their hands on it, and then for them to reach out to the family. By the time anyone actually reaches out to the family with an offer of services in these cases, it could be at best weeks down the road, and probably more common, we're talking about months down the road. And at that point, if you're a parent who was in crisis calling the police for help, like what is that worth to you at that point, right? So part of the problem with our traditional response is that families only receive service when the triggering event is some arrest, and then it goes through the criminal justice process. And part of the struggle for us is that, and I don't think this is, it takes a rocket scientist to understand this, but parents oftentimes don't want to participate in the formal court system because they don't want their children to have criminal records. So if my daughter became violent in my home and I called the police because I was in crisis wanting help, I wanted help. I don't want my daughter to have a criminal record so that it makes it harder for her to move on in life, to get into college and get housing down the road. So parents don't want a criminal record. They just want help, right? And what's also kind of a disconnect is we need the parents' help to turn the kid around. And when you inject the kid, this process into our legal court system, you basically remove that protective factor of the parent, and then the parent's role is diminished, and then they're afraid to parent because now they have their kid in the system and they don't know what to do. And so the longer we wait to intervene, the higher the risk that the youth becomes. And so this was a stat that we pulled up in King County, and we've determined that about 40% of the cases that we received, we didn't even file charges because the parents from go, like the kid would get arrested, he'd go into detention, and then we would explain to the parents what was going to happen. And then the parents were like, heck no, I don't want that. I mean, I just wanted help. I don't want the kid to be hooked up with a defense attorney who is going to say whatever they're going to say to my child. And I don't want them to have a criminal record. So I don't want to prosecute. I don't want to participate. I don't want to help out. And then so our office, because we couldn't legally proceed, we don't file charges. And then what? Right? And so what we, before we developed our FIRS program, we want to kind of just see how were we doing? Like, what were we doing with these cases? Like, I anecdotally, I could tell that we weren't really helping these families at all. And I just wanted to know what were we doing? So back in 2013, we did an audit of all of our DV cases that we got that year that fit this category. And it was about 500 or so cases. And then we followed every case to its very end. And what we found was that less than 3% of all of those 500 cases did a young person and their family receive any sort of evidence-based intervention. 3%. So 97% of the cases, the families got nothing. And so at some point we decided, well, what are we doing? Why are we doing this? Like, if we're helping less than 3%, we might as well be doing nothing, because what we also found when you actually talk to the parents is that when they contacted the system and we weren't able to help them, things got worse, right? So play this out. If you're a parent, you call the police on your child because you were so desperate. And then when you get to the system and the kid is charged with a crime, and you don't want your son or daughter to have a criminal record, and then you go to the prosecutor and say, I don't want to prosecute, I don't want to participate, I'm out. What does that say to your child, right? I mean, what is said to the child who was being abusive and out of control is like, yeah, mom, you can't even call the police on me because you're not going to follow through and they're not going to do anything. And then now as a parent, you bring your child home and the message our system has sent to that family is, go look somewhere else for help because we're not here to help you. And then what we found when talking to parents is that the violence not just returned, it oftentimes got worse and it didn't go away. And just because we weren't hearing from them anymore didn't mean that it was better. It just meant that they knew that they couldn't call the police and knew that the system would help them. And so what we found was that, one, we weren't helping these families at all. Remember what I said, less than 3%. And by engaging the system, the situation got worse. And so again, you ask yourself, why do we do what we do? And so when you talk to parents and find out really what they want, it's really not that different than what all victims want, right? They want to feel safe. They want the violence to stop. Parents in particular do not want their children in detention or charged with crimes, but they might need a little respite from their kid because they're not feeling safe at home, okay? Parents in particular want to be taken seriously. They want to feel supported by the system, by the police, courts, social services. They want help motivating their children to change their behavior. And they ultimately want us or to help them convey the message to the young people that violence is not okay. I was able to peek in at a presentation before this one on teen sexting, and I found it interesting and not surprising that a lot of the bullying and violent behavior are kids who come from violent families. And so for me, part of this whole process of trying to bring healing to a home that's in crisis is the crime prevention strategy, right? If you can help these families become healthier and have less violence, I am convinced, based on my experience as a prosecutor, that that makes our community safer. Because there are plenty of studies that talk about how one of the greatest, highest indicators of recidivism and future violent behavior is domestic violence involvement or domestic violence history. So not surprising at all. So what is the FIRS response? How is it different than our traditional response? So very similar. Yeah, when parents are in crisis, at this point in our society, their only recourse is typically they'll call 911. The law enforcement responds, and instead of taking the child to juvenile detention, they bring the kid to detention, but the kid is screened immediately into our FIRS respite center, all right? And so I want to pause here. I do see a future and a vision where we can equip our police officers to respond in a different way, in a variety of ways, rather than just the handcuffs and to a detention facility. Our hope one day is for law enforcement to be trained up so that they can respond to these incidents and bring the kids directly to our FIRS center. And then also to have these centers all throughout the county. I mean, King County is a very large geographical space, and we have one FIRS center, which is in downtown Seattle. And it does pose a challenge if you're in South King County, for example, to have a law enforcement officer truck a kid all the way to Seattle, when it would be great to have these FIRS centers located all throughout the county. But anyways, I digress. So instead of the kid being strip searched and put into a jumpsuit, they are routed into our 24/7 respite center. And there, instead of a kid going through that criminogenic sort of process of being booked and all that stuff, which again, tons of studies that talk about how just that interaction can kind of cement that criminal mindset in a young person. So we bypass that, and a young person is routed into our FIRS center, where they get to wear their own clothes, and the questions aren't about like dealing with the legal process, but they immediately talk with a skilled youth worker who just asks them, are they okay? Do they feel safe? Are they hungry? Are they tired? And just to do an initial safety assessment and just to make sure the kid is okay. And then once you can de-escalate that, then our team reaches out to the parents and the victims, and then we do a violence safety assessment, safety planning, offer services and support. And the hook is then, once everyone gets together, we come up with an action plan where if the young person abides by that, then as a prosecutor, we agree not to file charges, right? And so what does FIRS stand for? It's Family Intervention and Restorative Services. Like I said, it's really a new approach to serving families and dealing with violence in the home. The goal is to address the immediate family safety and expedite access to intervention and services. And so instead of that process that I told you could take weeks, if not months, we're talking within 24 hours, this family is being assessed and offered services for help. Something that's very important that I want to stress is that this only works if you can get cross-systems collaboration. As a prosecutor, I can't do this myself. Certainly public defenders can't do it themselves, and probation can't do it themselves. And so it really requires buy-in from all system folks to do this. And what we have found in King County is that it wasn't a hard sell, right? Like when you tell people, yeah, we do nothing for these families and we make things worse, I think it's pretty easy to get people to do something else. This process is really restorative and rooted in the concepts of restorative justice, really trying to engage a young person's understanding of their behavior and the impacts that it has, and really trying to motivate them to change. Because I think it's really easy and convenient to just say like some kids are bad to the core, and they're just bad kids, and there's no changing them. I think, you know, even from a prosecutor's perspective, I've come to really learn that kids have a real great capacity to change, and most kids want to change. I think they don't want to be bad and to have to not have a future. And so I think it's incumbent on the adults to figure out how to connect with those young people to get them to change. And then it's really providing a more consistent and effective resource for law enforcement to respond to youth acting out. Because like I said, I sympathize with our police officers, because this is a very difficult situation to respond to. And I firmly believe that this process makes it much less likely that they're returning to those homes over and over and over again, because as I'll show you, we found this to be pretty effective. So what we did with our FIRS Respite Center, and we opened it back in July of 2016, is like I think most places across the country, juvenile referral rates are going down and juvenile detention numbers are going down. And so our facility had a wing that we weren't using. And so we basically took the locks off the doors, put in a new reception area, and built a new door to the hallway that bypasses our secure detention area. And so it is truly a non-secure area of our building where people can walk in and out. And so it had 7 beds in it, and on a shoestring budget. As you can see, we tried our best to soften it up a little bit, and I think it turned out pretty good. So that mural that you see on the wall there, we commissioned that through our arts program in King County. And so a group of young people who were going through the system actually designed and painted that. And so that was pretty cool as well. And so really, instead of an incarceral environment, the hope is to change it into a therapeutic environment where you're really like trying to bring the temperature down with the young person and their parents, and really like creating a space where they can start talking about their issues and trying to figure out what they need to help get the violence to stop in the home. So this was back in 2016. Since then, we have built a brand new children and family justice center. And so we have a new wing that we designed for the FIRS program. And now we have 18 beds for our FIRS program. And so, yeah. I mean, some of you might be asking, well, Jimmy, like, how do you keep the kids there if it's not secure, right? I mean, if the police come, aren't the kids just gonna run? And I will confess that when we went down this road with this idea, that was what was in my head the whole time. But you know, we certainly aren't the first ones to think of a respite center. We actually stole this idea, or in other words, borrowed this idea from our friends down in Pima County in Arizona. So they were dealing with a rising issue around youth incarceration, and they were determined to reduce that. And similar to us, their findings were that most of their bookings involved juvenile domestic violence. And so they decided that they were going to create a respite center. Now we took ours to another level. In Pima County, it's just purely a respite center, but the legal process and everything still remains the same. It was just somewhere else to put a kid instead of their secure detention. And we asked them the same question, and they were like, out of 1,000 cases or something like that, 1 kid ran. And we're like, really? And so in our experience, we've been operating our FIRS center now for almost 4 years. And to my knowledge, we've had 2 kids leave the facility, and 1 kid left for like a half a second and then came back. And so it's not that it doesn't happen, but so far it has been a very rare situation, because our center is full right now, and it's regularly full. And so to only have 2 kids walk out has been pretty remarkable. And I think it's a testament to our partners who run the facility. I think when you have a facility and the people you hire are doing a good job engaging the young people and really like convincing them that this is for their own good, I think that's what makes them stay there. It's certainly not the food, but I think it's them actually feeling like they're being heard and maybe feeling like they're going to get something good out of staying there. So these are some of the eligible offenses that we have. So these actual names may not mean really anything to you guys. So assault 2 is sort of a felony level assault in King County. And in King County, a felony assault has a variety of facts that can fit in that. And so there are certainly some types of assault 2s which we would not be comfortable going through the FIRS process, but there are others that we would, and so those are eligible. The assault 4 is basically our misdemeanor level assault. Malicious mischief is just property damage, and then harassment are threats. As I said, right now we do not include intimate partner or dating violence, but I'll say that I think attitudes are sort of changing on that. There was a time where I was sort of convinced that teen dating violence was really no different than adult intimate partner violence. And I think there are certainly similarities and we got to be careful about it. But there's also a part of me that thinks, look, if we can't get to a young person now while they're being violent, engaging in gender violence, then when are we going to do it? Like, are we just waiting for them to become adults abusing other partners, or is this an opportunity to really find an intervention that works? Because like I said, you know, if you follow the science, we're talking about young people with fairly malleable brains and personalities, and if not now, then when? And so we are exploring the possibility of, in the future, including intimate partner into this process, but really looking at intervention that hopefully works. All right. So this is just kind of a snapshot into a day in the life of our FIRS team, which is primarily made up of juvenile probation counselors and then master's level social workers. And so the FIRS team, they meet every day at 9 in the morning and they screen the cases that came in the night before, and they staff each case with the probation counselors, the step-up social workers. I'll talk about step-up in a second, and then the supervising managers. And then oftentimes, this is where that collaboration is really important, because they might get a case where they're not quite comfortable, and so they'll just give me or my team a call and say like, hey, we'd like to run this case by you guys and see if you guys are comfortable with this going through the FIRS process. And so it's really like this open line of communication where we trust each other to make good decisions. And then they review the police reports, do all the notes, and they try and gather as much information as possible so that we can make good decisions on what to do with these cases. And then once we make the determination that the FIRS process would be good for this family, our master's level social workers contact the parents and they do a violence risk assessment to really figure out what the needs and safety concerns are. The probation counsel will then go to the FIRS center, meet with the young person, gather, again, as much information as they can, complete the risk needs assessment, and then a safety plan is developed and then shared with the family to say like, hey, this is our recommendation on what would be good for your family, or what, at least what we can offer to your family to try and reduce the violence in the home. And then once the family is signed up for that, they are engaged in the restorative process, really giving their input on what would work for them and what support and accountability means to them. And then we do a FIRS agreement, which is completed, and the youth and the parents sign off on it, and they agree that they're gonna avail themselves of the services that we're offering. And then once that happens, the case gets assigned to a field probation counselor who then works with the family to continue supporting them as needed. And the reason it goes out to the field is obviously, like I said, our county is large, and so we want to make sure that the probation counselor working with this family is geographically close to them. So this is some of the information that we try and get in our violence and risk safety assessments. And this shouldn't come as a surprise, trying to figure out what history has been involved, what safety concerns the parents have, what type of violence has occurred in the home. Is there any mental health, substance use concerns? We really want to know how the parents feel about having the kid return home, and if not, what needs to happen. Are there alternative placements? All those things. Is there other family violence occurring in the home? Again, going back to that last training, when seeing if some of this is learned behavior and what's going on there. What other services have been in place in the past? And this is really good because I want to tell sort of another anecdote about why this makes so much sense and why we were motivated to create this program. Is, a lot of the cases that I saw when I first got to the juvenile division involved families who called the police because their children were having a psychotic meltdown, or they were having a psychotic break. And that's not uncommon. Young people nowadays are dealing with a lot of stresses, and there is a lot of mental health issues. And you would have parents who call the police, and then when the police have no other options or skills to do something different, and then these parents see the police officers handcuffing their kids and bringing them to the detention facility, you hear these parents say, I don't want my kid arrested. I want them to go to the hospital, but the police, that's their known response, and there isn't any other options, right? And so understanding if the family has already been engaged with mental health treatment or other substance abuse treatment is really important. Is the youth willing to engage in services is always important as well, because if the youth is not motivated to change, then this is likely not to be successful. Yes, there's a question about providing specific examples of the RJ processes. So yes, I will talk about our step-up program. That's one of the ones that we're using, and so I'll get to that. And so the FIRS meeting where, once we've gathered all the information, come up with the plan, the social worker and probation counselor meet with the youth and parents at the FIRS center, and they develop the safety plan to be used by the kid in the home. So the step-up program, they do a restorative questionnaire, and it's really used to facilitate a dialogue between the young person and the parent about what's happening and what needs to occur before you can start repairing the relationships. And then this restorative inquiry then creates a pathway to discuss what services are needed. And I'm glad that there was a question about, restorative processes, because, one of the things that, again, helped convince us that this was the right process is, as all of you know, our criminal legal process is rooted in that foundation of, it's an adversarial process, right? And in many ways, the United States and our system of justice has prided ourselves on this adversarial process to get to the truth, right? And while that system is very effective for certain things, it is actually harmful for what we're trying to accomplish in these kinds of cases. Because ultimately, when a family's in crisis and they want to feel safe in their home, they want healing in the home, right? And it is impossible, in my opinion, to bring healing and safety to a home by bringing a parent and their child to war in a courtroom. It just doesn't work. And for those of you who see these cases play out in a courtroom, you know what I'm talking about, because when a kid has been violent with their parents, what our system does is we put them through the court process, and with that comes a public defender. And again, I'm not making this comment as a knock on public defenders, because I have the utmost respect for their role in the process. But in this scenario, their job is to defend the rights and represent the position of this young person who has been violent with his parents. And sometimes that requires them to, excuse my language, to shit on the parents and to talk about how bad the parents are. And sometimes there's truth in that. And it is very painful to see this play out in a courtroom when you have a judge trying to decide, do I keep this kid in detention or do I release the kid? And then you have the defense attorneys advocating for release of the kid because that's what the kid wants. And oftentimes the argument involves blaming the incident on the parents, trying to minimize the conduct of their client. And in my opinion, all of this has the exact opposite effect of what we want to have happen in these homes. So this is part of these are the questions that are part of the restorative inquiry. So what was the behavior? And then who was harmed by the behavior? What was the harm and the damage that was done? And then what can you do to repair the harm? What could you have done differently? And what do you all need to prevent repeating the behavior again? And so really, like, for someone who has been so steeped in our adversarial process and kind of the criminal justice due process model, I will confess, like, this was very difficult for me. Like, part of me was like, well, what does this have to do with anything? Like, my job as a prosecutor is to apply the law and say, did this kid commit a crime and what crime was that? And then I'm going to prove it. And then there's accountability. Like, to me, like, I would ask the question, well, where's the accountability here? But then it took me some time to step back and really ask myself, well, what's the accountability in the criminal legal process that I described? Like, nothing that I described involved the young person who caused the harm to do anything. I was doing all the work, and then we would wait for some time, and then oftentimes we would punish the kid and then force them to do something. And then by that time, like I said, it's months down the road. The kid may not know what we're talking about anymore. And so anyways, like, I really have come around to appreciating that really, like, forcing young people who have caused harm to answer these questions is accountability. And it is the type of things that can lead to meaningful change in behavior. So after that inquiry and finding the answer to those questions, they meet again and they come up with that service plan for the youth. And these service plans are created with a focus on identifying what services will support the youth and family in preventing reoffending. And then, the great thing about how we intentionally designed this is that even though none of these cases are going through the formal court process or the legal process, the whole menu of services is available to them. And that's really what I was talking about when less than 3% of all of our cases led to any sort of evidence-based intervention. All of these families that go through the FIRS Center are immediately offered, if it's applicable to them and if they want to engage, substance abuse evaluation, counseling, mental health evaluation and treatment, in-home cognitive behavioral therapy treatment, whether it's multi-systemic therapy or family functional therapy. We're going to offer all of that if that's what we think is going to get this family into a good place. Because ultimately, we were going to offer these things anyways if we went through the system. And so offering it up front right away is what this program is aiming to do. So once that agreement is signed, like I said, it goes out to a juvenile probation counselor, and then the family in their neighborhood to help support them and to follow the process. During the duration of the agreement, the probation counselor is working with the family, and then sometimes we have to adjust the agreement to better support the family and be able to be nimble and shift in the way that we support them. And our juvenile probation counselors are trained in motivational interviewing and engagement skills to do their best to keep the young person engaged and motivated to follow through. So this is some of the things that, you know, we hear the parents saying. So this was a parent who talked about how this was a blessing for them, and really, like, as a Black family, seeing this option for the young Black males who were disproportionately prosecuted and put through our juvenile justice system. They found that this was very beneficial for them. This is a letter that a young person wrote to our FIRS staff, and it's really interesting to see young people respond in this way, right? I like the end. Also, I promise never to come back because I was arrested. So, you know, these are some of the good stories, and I'm going to give you folks some time to read this letter, and I'm going to share some other anecdotes. You know, when we flipped the switch and started this program, I'll admit I was pretty nervous because I didn't really know how it was going to work out. There was no other model to follow, and you know, this was a pretty big investment. But I remember going down to court to watch the first court hearings where kids were going through the FIRS process. And I'm going to explain something. I don't want to get too much in the weeds, but we kind of flipped the switch before we had our respite center running. Because for those of you who might be out there saying, like, well, we don't have the money for a respite center or whatever, we can't fund that. You can actually still do this program even if you're still having to book kids into your juvenile detention facility. It just means all this work happens in detention. But it just requires a shift in thinking of what's important. And frankly, it requires prosecutors to let go of this belief that we can fix things by prosecuting people. So anyways, I remember the first cases that came through, the team had already met with the young person, met with the family, and they had come up, did, you know, that restorative inquiry, and they had come up with a engagement plan. But these kids still had court, because in King County, you have to have a court hearing within a certain amount of time once a kid is booked into detention. It's called our first appearance hearing. It's the first time the kid shows up in court. And I'll tell you, in the past, these were the hearings that were heartbreaking, because you had parents who were scared, but then they were being asked, do you want to take your kid home? Because if you don't take your kid home, he's going to be sitting in juvie. And you would have these parents really struggling because they weren't getting any services. And like, how hard is it to be in open court telling a judge and everyone in the courtroom, I am so scared of my kid, I don't want them home. And so oftentimes you have parents really lying to the judge and saying like they felt safe when they didn't feel safe. Or you had parents saying like, I just can't take it and I don't want my child home. And then again, what does that do to the young person? When you're sitting there, and yes, you were violent with your parents, but then to hear them actually say out loud, I don't want him home. I mean, we were just destroying these families. And so I remember the first case involved this kid who was violent with his dad. And I remember the judge just like, I don't know if she knew what he was going to say, but she was just like, hey, why don't you tell me? What do you think about this FIRS program? How do you think it's going? And I remember being like almost knocked off my chair. The kid said, you know, Your Honor, I think this program is going to be a blessing for my family, because I think I realized that I don't do a good job listening and hearing my parents. And I think they don't do a good job listening and hearing me. And so I do think this is going to be really good for us. And so I remember like making eye contact with the judge, and we were both like, did we just hear what this kid just said? And it was a really powerful moment. I'll also share another story of this parent. Once we had our FIRS center up and running, it was a case where her son came in because he, she called the police again because he was putting holes in the walls and all this stuff. And this was an interesting case because when it came in and we looked at this kid's history, it turned out that we had him on a similar type of case like 2 years prior. And when we were talking to this mom, we asked her, well, wow, what happened? 2 years ago, you didn't want to prosecute, and then you called today. And she was like, yeah, the violence never stopped. He just got worse. And then this was the straw that broke the camel's back. And so she called again. And then now her son was in the FIRS center. And then they did the assessment early on. And it turned out he really needed a mental health assessment, right? And we remember our FIRS team asked the mom, what do you want to see happen with this case? Or like, how long do you think your son needs to be out of the house? And she was like, I want him to be here for 30 days. And we remember saying to ourselves, ooh, 30 days. But what we told the mom was, that's fine. Yeah, he can stay here for 30 days and we'll figure it out, but we'll keep working with you guys. And then so that was her first comment. And then after they did the assessment, they got him a mental health assessment. I think it was going to be like 72 hours later. And so the mom then reached out to us and said, hey, would it be okay if I came and picked up my son and took him to the assessment? And we're like, oh, of course, it's your son. And you can take him and then just bring him back. And she's like, okay. And then she's like, and I don't think he needs to be there 30 days anymore, maybe just a week. And then, so we're like, yeah, that's fine. I think, that's great. And then, so she came on the day of his assessment to pick him up, and they sat in the FIRS center and they were just talking to each other. And you can tell like they were really speaking and hearing each other. And then the mom came up to our FIRS staff and asked the question. And it was interesting because she was kind of sheepish asking about it. And she said, do you think it'd be okay if I just took him to the assessment and then took him home after? And we were like, of course you can. It's your son. Yeah, of course you can take him home. And for any of you who are prosecutors on this call, again, in like the 20 years that I've been a prosecutor, I have never been able to tell a victim that you have complete control over what's going to happen with this case. I mean, to be able to provide this service to this family within 72 hours of the incident happening was remarkable. And it really is, like, these stories are endless when you talk to our team who are doing these cases. So we are very fortunate in King County that we do have really the subject matter experts in the area of adolescent family violence. So we have these two amazing individuals named Lily Anderson and Greg Rout who have been doing this work their whole careers. And as they were trying to help families through this process, realized that there really wasn't a curriculum anywhere in the world that dealt with juvenile intrafamilial violence. And so they ended up developing one themselves and really becoming not just national, but international experts on this. They actually travel all over the world talking about the Step Up program. And so these are some of the demographics that we've come up with. Not surprisingly, mostly young males are the offenders, and then again, not surprisingly, mostly abusing moms or female caretakers. So like I said, when the program started, there was really no literature or research on this or models that guide the practice. And so our Step Up program evolved through piloting learning exercises and approaches and then kind of witnessing how that impacted the youth and parents to change. And so there was initially a first edition curriculum, but Lily and Greg finished their second edition curriculum right when we were starting the FIRS Center, and it really includes a lot more brain-based and cognitive behavioral therapy stuff and restorative practice elements that Lily and Greg incorporated into the program. And so these are some of the things that are research-based that are being used in our step-up program. And to that question about what are some of the restorative processes that we're using. So there is cognitive behavioral learning, skills-based and strength-based approaches. And it's really the group sessions that are really effective. And so you have the young people and their parent coming into group and sitting in circle with other young people and their parents, and really talking through the challenges and issues and kind of coming to some group consensus around what's healthy and safe in these families. They've also incorporated a lot of parent training to help you change behavior. So like I said, well, I don't recall if I said it, but one thing that we definitely learned is, as a prosecutor, sometimes I would read these cases and I would be like, wait a second, the wrong person kind of got arrested here, where sometimes things escalate because the parents are not equipped or don't have the support or skills to de-escalate and manage the situation. And so a lot of our step-up program actually involves a lot of support and help for the parents as well. And so these are some of the key factors that we have determined really lead to helping young people change. And it's really around actually meaningful accountability, not like accountability in the sense that most of us think about accountability, which is a cinder block cell or some criminal record, but accountability through the probation council, where they're monitoring behavior weekly and checking in on them and making sure that they're doing what they need to be doing. Really focusing on stopping the violence through safety plans, providing behavioral skills to replace the abuse and violence, and really giving both parent and child the skills necessary to de-escalate. Setting, weekly goals, and again, so having things that can help reinforce accountability, really involving the parent caretaker. I think part of where our criminal justice system falls flat is that oftentimes, we will say we know better, and we're the ones who have a monopoly on how to keep our community safe. And I think what's really, special about our FIRS program and step-up program is that it really listens to the people who are impacted by the violence and really following their lead on what they think will help keep them safe. And then really following this restorative practice framework for taking responsibility and for causing harm, and to help make amends in a meaningful way. Because going back to kind of how this is so different than our actual legal system is, I think about my 10-year-old daughter, and I'm married to a lawyer myself, and she used to be a prosecutor. And we talked about this, and we thought, how funny would it be if we followed our criminal justice system in disciplining our daughter. So let's say our daughter did something wrong in the house, and instead of saying, Coco, why did you do that? And how can we support you so you stop doing that? Instead of doing that, what I did was, all right, Coco, don't say anything. Don't apologize, because you have the right to remain silent. And you also have the right to an attorney. And so I'm gonna assign you your mom as your attorney. And then as your dad, my job is, I'm gonna prove what you did. And then maybe a month later, then we're gonna punish you for what you did. How ridiculous is that, right? And so it's interesting when you think of it in kind of common sense ways. Our system oftentimes lacks really common sense. So really, these are the pillars of restorative practice, is really identifying what the harm is and what the needs are, and then to really engage the actual parties involved, and then to have meaningful accountability and obligations to repair that harm. So this is like, again, these are the things that I'm talking about. This is the difference between the two approaches, right? So in the criminal justice approach, all I'm interested as a prosecutor in knowing is what law was violated, who's guilty of that law violation, and how are we going to punish that person, right? Whereas restorative justice is really looking at, who was harmed by the violation and what are their needs, right? And then who's responsible for violating the harm, or who created the harm, and then how will that party make things right, or how will they bring healing, right? So they're just very different questions. Whereas the criminal justice system, we're very focused on the offender, whereas in restorative justice is really focusing on the needs of the person harmed, and then how the person who caused the harm is going to make things right. And so this is some of the step-up restorative process. It really offers a framework for honest and respectful discussion about the harm that was caused. It really provides a guide for how people engage each other. It teaches lifelong skills to actively take responsibility. I think what's really important is that it really brings that empathy piece to all the parties involved. Invites this concept of forgiveness and understanding, and really opens the door to restoring relationships, right? So these are some of the things that we've learned about our FIRS program. It's not for everyone. Like, I'm not here to say like this is a silver bullet and that every kid and family that's come through FIRS has come out and everything's been fixed. Family dynamics are messy. Family violence is messy. And so this is really not for every kid. And probably unlike Nebraska, like we have this 80-20 theory where 20% of the kids commit 80% of the crimes in our county. And so sometimes those really high-risk kids who have had multiple prior interactions with the system and really know how to, I guess, game the system are probably not a good fit for the FIRS program, unfortunately. And then you do have some youth who choose not to comply with their agreement. And so sometimes we do end up back at square one because the violence continues, and then the parents have to call the police again. And so that's certainly a disappointing thing for the parents when it doesn't work out. But I still am convinced that even when it doesn't work out, we've at least tried to do something that we couldn't do through the system before. And so at least we have more information about what may not work. And obviously screening is vitally important, like making sure that that you're really able to meet the needs of the young person and their family before you put them through this process. But those are challenges, and those are the types of challenges that we see in our normal justice system anyways, right? But here are some of the successes that you don't see when you go through our formal legal system is, parents feel supported and validated immediately. Youth do take it seriously because they're receiving a really high level of attention from a JPC and their parent. It's an opportunity for families to take a break and regroup after a violent incident. So that's the respite piece is really vital, because if you don't have like that ability to separate the parties in a healthy way, it can be incredibly difficult to kind of triage the situation. The FIRS Center is a therapeutic environment, so it really can reduce youth resistance to services down the road. Here are some of the key findings that I think those of you who stayed on this call are probably really interested in. This is something that I found super remarkable. I think if Nebraska is like anywhere else, one of the issues that you're struggling with and we're all struggling with is how do we address the issue of racial and ethnic disproportionality in our criminal justice system. And one of the things that we found is, and it's kind of a double-edged sword, because it's good when you divert a lot of cases out of the system and come up with effective diversion programs. You're reducing the overall number of kids who touch our system. But what we were struggling with is the more diversion programs that we had, the kids who stayed in the system were increasingly more disproportionately Black and brown. And the reason that was the case is our diversion programs were doing a better job of engaging white families than their Black and brown peers. And so that was definitely a problem. But what we found when we looked at our FIRS data was that it maintained this remarkable level of equity across all races and ethnicities. So if you were a Black family, you were just as likely, if not more, to engage with our FIRS program than if you were a white family. And our theory behind that is, it's really remarkable how families choose to engage when you offer the services at the time they need it, right? You don't wait forever to try and find them and then offer the services. But when they really need it and you offer it, then regardless of what race or ethnicity you are, you engage at the same level. And so that was pretty remarkable. So our first full year of doing this, 79% of our youth arrested for family violence avoided secure detention. So out of 290 youth who were eligible for secure detention, we were able to divert 229 of those. That percentage has gone up significantly since we started this. I unfortunately don't have the most recent numbers to share. Again, our first full year, our DV cases jumped by 25%. However, there was only a 2% increase in the number of cases that we actually filed. The recidivism rate has been pretty interesting and remarkable as well. And so this is kind of a little confusing, so I'll try and explain it. So if you were a kid who went into the FIRS program, but then you didn't sign an agreement, so you were a kid and family who had a family violence case, but then for whatever reason, they didn't want to do the FIRS agreement or they didn't want to follow through. It was 40% had a follow-up law enforcement referral of any type, so not just DV, like shoplifting, burglary, whatever it was, or taking a motor vehicle within 12 months. If you went into the FIRS program and then you signed an agreement, you entered into agreement, 22% of those had follow-up law enforcement referral. And so, those numbers don't jump out at you, but for anyone who has worked in criminal justice reform, that level of difference is pretty staggering and remarkable, and kind of shows the effectiveness of the program. So this is some of the gender breakdown. Again, not surprising that it's mostly male. And then this was kind of that equity piece that I showed. So really, the two sort of race ethnic categories that traditionally do better when it comes to criminal justice numbers are the Asian Pacific Islander and white. But in regards to engagement with the FIRS program, it's actually African American, Black, and Latinx families who actually engage at a higher rate. And so that was really promising to see. So that is the end of my presentation. This is my email. I'm always happy to share documents, any sort of literature that we have on this program, or to just jump on a call and answer any other questions. And so I can be reached by email. It's the best way to reach me. And so there you go. I'm going to see if we have a little time for questions. There was a question, is this public-private partnership program available? So for us, it is at the county level. I don't know if I quite understand the question, but there really isn't a private partnership. So we do partner with a nonprofit organization called Pioneer Human Services. So they are the ones who staff our FIRS center. So if that's a public-private partnership, then we do have that at the county level. All right. Okay, if there are no questions, thank you, everybody. Appreciate you joining on, and everyone be safe and be healthy, and wish everyone the best.